think it is a good moment now to talk a little bit more about philosophy, and especially the internal division of the field of philosophy into smaller sections. So according to this slide, which illustrates this kind of classical division of philosophy, the basic three parts, the three areas of philosophy are metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Metaphysics asks the question, what is real? This is like the most abstract philosophy. What is real? What exists? Metaphysics can be further subdivided into ontology and cosmology. Ontology asks questions about existence and being. So I would say the purest form, the most abstract form of philosophy is ontology, which is the subsection of metaphysics. Cosmology asks a question about the nature of the universe, the origin of the universe. Cosmos is the Greek word for the universe, so it's about nature of the world around us. So this is metaphysics, and especially ontology as part of the metaphysics. This is something that is not only true about philosophy, this is about any area of culture, any area of social life, literature studies, art studies, you name it. So once you learn this table, it will serve you throughout the rest of your studies. The second branch of philosophy is epistemology. Epistemology tries to answer the question, how do we know? How can we know it? So it deals with knowledge, with gathering knowledge. We can know through experience, authority, reason, intuition, active construction. This is the area of pedagogy. So how do we teach people? Many of you, if you haven't had the experience of teaching someone, let's say the foreign language, you may want to do it in the future. So this is the area of epistemology. How do we know? How do we learn? How can we learn something ourselves and teach others about something? And then we have axiology. Axiology is what is right, what is good. So it's mostly either, it's about the good and the beautiful. So we have the ethics and the aesthetics as parts of axiology. So it's about morality and about beauty. Let's make it very general. So these things will hopefully, as I said, serve you until the end of your studies. And now a few more slides with some thinkers and some concepts that define postmodernism, and some intellectuals who introduced new ways of dealing with analyzing culture in post-modern times. So probably the name that will crop up many times during your studies, if you want to study language, if you want to study literature, if you want to study culture, is Jacques Derrida. He was a French philosopher and linguist, a kind of all-around intellectual. His texts have a bad reputation of being very difficult, but of course probably sooner or later you'll have to read some excerpts, some of the names, some of the titles of the works he published, his most influential books, like Of Grammatology or Writing and Difference, both from the 60s, so the time of this youth counterculture. What he is remembered for now are some of the concepts he introduced to cultural studies. Things like, first and foremost, deconstruction. Deconstruction is a kind of analytical method. He started by observing that traditional dualities are not really stable. So these things, these values that were absolutely taken for granted by the modernists, like the duality between speech and writing, between human and nature, between male and female. So all these very clearly cut dualities, Derrida observed they are not really that stable. The difference is mostly in our perception, in our way of speaking, of writing, of analyzing these phenomena. Here is a very famous quotation from him. You have it in the English translation and also in the original French, which I'm not going to read, but the English translation is, "There is nothing outside the text." Like, everything we know about the world is in our interpretation of the world. This is what he believed, and this is a very postmodernist concept. And deconstruction is a way of looking at some phenomena, like literature, to uncover these problems. The problems that he sometimes calls aporia. This is, again, a Greek philosophical term which means confusion, puzzlement, doubt, impasse. For Derrida, it was a very positive thing. If you were no longer sure that you were right, it means you were a mature person, for Derrida. Some more, he liked to create new words, like hauntology. It's like haunting, this is what the ghosts do, plus ontology. Ontology is how something exists. So like the ghosts of ideas haunting reality. Or another word that he introduced, logocentrism. Centrism for center and logos for reason. So the modernist view of the world that favored reason over passion, over intuition, the IQ over the soft skills, science over humanities, let's put it this way. For him, this was a problem. This was too stable, and he believed that reality is not as stable as most people think. Another term that he introduced and he worked a lot around, and not only Derrida but other intellectuals such as Jacques Lacan or Emmanuel Levinas. They were philosophers. Lacan was a psychoanalyst, a kind of follower, and well, he was a follower of Freud, but he wanted to modernize the theory of Freud very much. This concept is the other, with a capital O, the other, or alterity. The other is the opposite of the self, psychologically or philosophically or culturally. The way we construct identity, values, norms, and everything in social life is by creating the other. So we can know what we are if we can point to something that we definitely are not. That is why I put the poster for Frankenstein. If you ever have a chance of watching this theater production of Frankenstein with Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller, they actually alternated. One evening, one of the actors played Dr. Frankenstein, and the other one played the creature, the monster. The other evening, they changed. So the idea is, hopefully, as you can observe, that both these creatures, Dr. Frankenstein and the monster, are like the self and the other. So the identity of the doctor is only through the existence of the monster. And perhaps the doctor is the monster, if you think about that. Another intellectual whom you met briefly earlier in this semester, Michel Foucault, the historian of ideas. This is how he described his specialty. He was mostly interested in the relationship between knowledge and power. So things like social institutions of control, the insane asylum, the hospital, the prison, the school, all the institutions that supported the hierarchy, that promoted certain worldview in history, the 18th century, the 19th century. He's mostly credited now for introducing the term discourse. Discourse, simply put, means the way of speaking, the way of discussing a subject. So, for example, when he wrote about homosexuality in the 19th century, he wrote quite a lot about it. He wrote a book about the history of sexuality. He was also gay himself, so he knew something about it. He observed that this subject was treated from three different possible sides, three different discourses: the medical discourse, the legal discourse, and the moral or religious discourse. So depending on what kind of way of speaking you employed, it could be seen as a deviation, so some sort of, let's say, madness, a crime that could send you to prison, or a sin which was immoral and for which you had to repent. So this is the discourse, the way of speaking, which also influences the way of analyzing certain phenomena. Another French intellectual, Roland Barthes, the founder of semiotics, which means the study of meaning, mostly in culture. The best book he wrote, and this is quite approachable, so if you'd like to read just one of those postmodernist intellectual books, start with this one, Mythologies, from the late 50s. This is a semiotic analysis of popular culture. So he writes short essays about photography, food, fashion, sports, toys, movie stars, magazines for women, how these everyday things convey symbolic meaning, how they represent the culture that created them. A very, very interesting and quite amusing book. Another famous text that he wrote is The Death of the Author. This is something that became almost a kind of phrase, the death of the author. It means author's intentions are not the most important thing in literature. You do not need to reconstruct the biography of the author to understand the work of fiction. So, the work of fiction exists not necessarily as the extension of its author. One of the areas that he was most interested in was narratology, the study of storytelling and the way that narrative structures affect our perception. So we are here, strictly speaking, in literature studies, and how modernism and postmodernism were reflected in literature studies. And I would say that nowadays it is still the most widespread way of reading literature. And if you go to any literary courses here in the Institute, you will probably meet these thinkers again. And the last name, Zygmunt Bauman, recently deceased sociologist and philosopher who was born in Poland. He was exiled in 1968 on the wave of anti-Semitic riots in Poland. He moved to Britain and he became a professor of the University of Leeds, and he mostly wrote about the modern or postmodern society. He was of Jewish descent, so he was interested in the Jewish experience. So of course, he wrote about modernity and the Holocaust. But his other works are not really from the Jewish perspective. However, they are very good and fairly readable, easy to read. Analysis of the postmodern society. The postmodernity and its discontents, or liquid modernity. He wrote about postmodernity and consumerism. This is a similar attitude to what Durkheim was doing a century earlier. Like, why is it so bad when everything is supposed to be so good? We have the constant progress, we have the growing technology, we have the improved standards of living compared to other generations. Why so many people are unhappy? And why so many people are committing suicide, among other things? His answer is because of the growing uncertainty of life. So the stress caused by uncertainty. This is what he calls the liquid modernity, or liquid fear. New categories of excluded people. The uncertain social structures. So something that was observed much earlier by Durkheim. It's still valid. The last two slides, one is about something that's basically happening right now in cultural studies. So the intersectional perspective, mostly embodied by the so-called identity politics, that is the combination of different identities in a person. So usually this is about the underprivileged groups, so the groups that were given the voice in the youth counterculture of the 60s, so women, the blacks and other people of color, LGBT, environmentalists, anti-militarists, minority rights, whatever. You have such groups, but it's absolutely possible to be a woman and an environmentalist, or to be an LGBT person and black at the same time, and sometimes these identities combine in a person. More often than not, here we have an example in the picture. So it's quite a sad view, really, this modernity and post-modernity. So I decided to add one last image, which is a bit more optimistic. A quote from a writer, Miguel de Unamuno. Fascism is cured by reading, and racism is cured by traveling. I've done both, reading and traveling, quite a lot. And I would like to assure you that it does work, and I hope it works for you. And see you next week. Thank you.